If you Google the phrase, "Is this normal?" you're going to receive more than 1.5 billion results in under a second. That's 1.5 billion people asking the internet whether or not what they are experiencing is normal. So this is obviously a question that a lot of people are concerned about. And it's also a major question in psychology. So what is normal and what is abnormal or not normal? This is a far more complex question than it may seem. Is there even such a thing as normal? Most abnormal behaviors are present in the lives of completely normal people. Take, for instance, the feelings of worthlessness or sadness. These could be a sign or a symptom of a psychological disorder, such as major depression. But completely normal people can feel sad or worthless from time to time. So how do we tell the difference? How do we decide if feeling sad is normal or if it's a sign of a psychological disorder? Before we dive into what's normal and what's abnormal, I just want to throw another word out there, and that word is insane. So insane is not the same as abnormal. Insane is actually a legal term, not a psychological term. Lawyers, judges, and the criminal justice system use the definition of insanity to distinguish between people who can be held accountable for the actions that they carry out and people who, because of their psychological states, cannot be held accountable for crimes that they may have committed. Psychologists and psychiatrists almost never use the word insane, so let's leave the word insane behind and talk about some things that we look at when we decide what's abnormal. So first we're going to look at how statistically common or uncommon a behavior is. So say we have a normal distribution. The x-axis represents mood. So on one end we have deep sadness, and on the other hand we have deep joy. And the y-axis represents the number of people. Now, if this is a normal distribution, most people will be right here in the middle. So if the y-axis represents number of people, we see that most of them are somewhere in the middle. And that's how a normal distribution works. And as we get to the far ends of the distribution, very small number of people remain. And these people are statistically uncommon. The second thing we're going to look at is whether something is socially deviant. And in deviant, we mean something that is outside of the formal or informal rules that a society has for what is okay, what's normal, what's expected. So in every society, there's this invisible bubble of expectations, norms. Anyone who's outside of this bubble, anyone who acts in a way that is considered weird or out of the norm, anyone who's socially deviant is going to behave in a way that society deems not okay, to be different enough to be deviant. Now you may notice that this is a little more complex because one society may think that the rules are one thing, while for another society the rules would be different. So a person that could be considered abnormal in one society could be totally normal within a different cultural context. Now, the third thing we're going to look at is whether a behavior is not adaptive or disturbing to the individual or to others. So a behavior is maladaptive if it disrupts a person's life, if it makes it hard for them to carry on with the things that they need to do day to day. So if someone is so sad that they lie in bed all day and find it really hard to go to school or to their work, then that may be a sign that this level of sadness is maladaptive, is beyond what's normal. A behavior could also be disturbing, either to the individual, so unpleasant thoughts and feelings, and the individual is suffering. That would also be a sign that this behavior may be abnormal. Or it could be disturbing to others. So if we think about people who are antisocial, who engage in violent or manipulative behavior without any remorse or regard for other people, that could very clearly be disturbing to people around them. And the last thing we're going to look at is whether a behavior is irrational, whether it makes sense to the average person. So if we go back to that normal distribution that we were thinking about before, and we say these people who are very, very sad are, I'm going to color over that in red because red is our color for abnormal. So they're experiencing an extreme level of sadness. But is there a context that we're not thinking about? So in the DSM, being sad for over 2 weeks is considered a sign of depression. But if we know that the person who is experiencing these emotions lost a loved one in the past month, it may be entirely normal for that person to be that sad for a little while. So that is not irrational. That makes sense to the average person. And that's why we use this criteria as one more piece of the puzzle. So to sum it all up, for a behavior to be considered abnormal, it has to be statistically uncommon. It has to be socially deviant. It has to be maladaptive and disturbing to the individual or to others, and it has to be irrational. It has to not make sense for the average person. Now, these are all pretty vague terms, to be honest, and we could raise questions about each of them. So, for instance, some psychological disorders are very common. About 20% of people experience anxiety or depression at one point in their life. So that's 1 out of 5. If we go back to the normal distribution, it's not just the end of the distribution, it's more like a big chunk. So how uncommon could that be considered? Social deviance, as we've already discussed, is very specific to a culture, a place, and a point in time, and it may change as we look at the context, which also complicates understanding what social deviance is. As for maladaptive and disturbing, some psychological disorders, for instance, people who are bipolar, they could be behaving in a very irresponsible way, but they might not feel like that's maladaptive. There might not be suffering there. It might not be disturbing to them. It might not even be disturbing to others. So we don't always see this criteria, even in some behaviors that are definitely abnormal. And what about the last part? Saying that something doesn't make sense to the average person is a little vague, and there could be some disagreement on what's rational or irrational. So these are all pretty complex ideas, because the human mind is complex, and deciding what's normal and what's not normal should not be a clear-cut, easy decision. And we all have to think very deeply about how context and different pieces of this puzzle work together to make up what's normal and what's not normal.